But we've sort of trained our systems in a lot of organizations to be very inflexible when it comes to standards and practices within the interview especially. And this is where we want to highlight that this is not a set system. This is not a law on how you need to interview people. Yeah, there are some laws that exist within that, and we should comply with them. We're not saying not to, right? But the flexibility to be more human is really a critical element to make your company's culture more neuroinclusive. Hi, welcome to the NITW Podcast. I'm Joe Riddle from Neurodiversity in the Workplace, and we are here to talk again about some of the case studies that we've worked on. And our overall goal in what we do at Neurodiversity in the Workplace is to really create cultures that are neuroinclusive, meaning we are bringing in people who are neurodivergent, we are helping them to succeed, and we're helping the company itself to be a more welcoming place for the 15 to 20% of the population that is neurodivergent. We see this as a critical need for the future of work, and so we help companies to try and get ready for that, try to be ready for that. So, Sean, what are we going to talk today about?
So, I wanted to share a case study from a somewhat recent partner of ours, because I think there were some valuable lessons learned for us and for the organization. And just, every partnership is a little bit different. Every company's way that they're organized and their culture and their values are a little bit different. And in what we do, we have to navigate that a little bit towards a consistent goal, but the context changes. And so we learn a little bit each time. And I thought this was an interesting one that was enlightening for me and I think might be for our audience. So as you mentioned in your intro, great intro, by the way, great overview of what we aim to do in our employer partnerships. What that often looks like is focused on a hiring program where, the kind of main goal at the end, not necessarily the end, but the main target that we're aiming for is a cohort of hires. It could range from 1 to 5 to 10 to 15, whatever. But, based on the organization, we set a goal of positions that we want to fill. And, that is not the only goal of the program, but it is, the focus and kind of context where we get to apply and learn a full swath of neuroinclusive practices. It kind of covers end to end the employee experience from support to onboarding to interviewing, et cetera. So that's why, this is such a key component of developing a program is going through the hiring process. So
if I can jump in, I think that when we look at why start with the hiring process, there's a number of things that we see really beneficial in doing that, right? If you want your company to be more neuroinclusive, yes, you can and should start with some trainings. You should help people understand what it is we're talking about. But it's like, and speaking as a neurodivergent person in the workforce myself, I think that it's like trying to read a recipe on how to bake a pie, right? You need the ingredients. And so you need to be able to identify, hey, there are neurodivergent people coming into our workplace. And what I find is really valuable about that is the ability for you to then be forced to respond to some of the needs of those people.
Yeah.
And I think that, yes, you can start with a learning experience, but it's never, from our experience, it's never as productive unless you're starting with bringing in people who identify as neurodivergent purposefully. And so that's why we always aim for this. This is why we try to say, yes, we want to do all of those cultural changes, but hiring is going to help speed up the process to get there. Instead of reading about baking the pie, it's starting to bake the pie right away.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, cool. Yeah. That sets the context for what we were aiming to do and what we often aim to do. So that was our goal. That was kind of the direction that this program was going. And then we took some twists and turns and learned a lot in the process. So with this particular partnership, we aimed to fill a fairly entry-level position. And what that normally looks like in our partnerships is we take responsibility for almost all of the end-to-end candidate management, from sourcing, pre-screening, candidate preparation, we've talked on the show many times about our interview method. That's a project-based, skills-based hiring process. We design and then we hands-on facilitate that interview with the hiring manager from the company present to obviously interview the candidate, but we're very hands-on in that process. And then, they make a hiring decision. We support the candidate through that. So where things most significantly changed in this particular talent management pipeline was there were certain elements of that end-to-end process where this partner had hesitancy to hand us the reins, which, yeah, every company has, certain things that they have to do things a certain way. We're prepared for that. And, we wanted to hear them out of okay, what do you not want to let go of ownership of? What do you need to do compliance-wise for consistency across, all your candidates, even outside this program? Totally fair. But those elements kind of added up over time to where the process looked very different than our usual hiring process that is very hands-on, very supported, and, is a skill-based interview method, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, what it ended up looking like, and then I'll go back and kind of point out what's missing from this process. What it ended up looking like was, okay, we owned the candidate sourcing, the candidate pre-screening, and then we would hand off to a recruiter from this organization to then do, kind of their standard pre-screening call. And if that went well, and we were partnered with that recruiter, they were aware of the program, they knew a little bit about neurodiversity, though we didn't do a formal training for that recruiter that was responsible for this pipeline and sort of that second step screening. But after that point, the candidate, if successful through me, through the recruiter, would advance to the hiring manager for the position. And the company made a decision in the interest of candidate privacy and avoiding disclosure and avoiding creating kind of this group, that group among the different candidates for this position. They deliberately did not notify the hiring manager that this candidate was neurodivergent, that they were coming from this program, or that they, would be interviewed in any kind of different way. And I get the value of candidate privacy, protecting disclosure. That's something we invest a lot of thought in, as do all the candidates that we work with. In our typical programs, there's a bit of trade-off there, saying, well, yes, you are disclosing, but you're disclosing by participating in this program in order to receive support and go through a deliberately different process. In this case, the company really wanted to lean on, in the interest of protecting disclosure over all things, we keep the process exactly the same. And
as their traditional hiring
process, there was no awareness, no training for the hiring manager about neurodiversity, no awareness about the program or about these candidates coming from the program. And I get wanting to protect disclosure and wanting to keep things kind of fair and anonymous in that way. But ultimately, over time, we did not see many, if any, hires. We ended up having, I believe, 114 candidates, applicants that initially went through me, that ended up going to the company through all of those steps, narrowing down to 17 candidates that had a interview with the hiring team. And out of those 17 candidates that were advanced, only one was selected for hire through that particular process. And that just was, kind of a red flag to me of that's very different than our typical, candidate to hire ratio. Normally, let's say we have 100 applicants, we'll narrow that down to, if it's only one role, sure, we'll narrow it down to 3 or 5 maybe candidates, and that will yield 1 or 2, sometimes even 3 hires through our process. So going from 17 candidates advancing in the process down to 1 hire was, okay, well, something's not working here.
Right. Yeah, and this is kind of a typical sort of fallacy of systems change or process change, where we see people want to make those changes. They invited us to come and do neuroinclusion work, neurodiversity hiring, programming, but yet we're unwilling to make any actual process changes to their system. And very often this is done out of goodwill. It's done out of a want to be compliant with existing laws, out of a want to be compliance with really good disclosure policies. But we get to the heart of what neuroinclusion is really quickly when we start to view everything within just compliance. And I think that it kind of gives us this really interesting sense of what, for example, human resources is within an organization, right? When we abandon a responsibility to have some sort of control over a company culture in favor of full control over just compliance, we start to lose a lot of the personness or the people-centeredness of a human resources process. Mm-hmm. And this really slows down any ability to welcome people. It also really hinders your ability to make people want to be retained by this company when they feel that the culture is about compliance, the culture is about performance, rather than acceptance, rather than taking some individual element out of a role, which is kind of what the idea of neurodivergence and neurodiversity in the workplace is. We want to be able to help this big machine, this big organization, start to make some minor adjustments that they can systemize, they can make existent within their company, mm-hmm. but have those minor adjustments be responsive to the individuals that are coming to work for them.
Yeah.
I always say that, employment is a 50-50 relationship, right? It's 50% employer and 50% employee. But when we view systems through a highly compliant way or a highly inflexible way, especially with hiring as an example, it no longer becomes a 50-50 relationship. It's like a 80-20 in favor of the employer, right? And people don't value that system. People want, in addition to a paycheck, which fair, an employer does provide that paycheck, mm-hmm. but they want to be valued for more than just their time on the clock. They want to be seen as an individual. And neuroinclusion programs can really help employers do that by saying, hey, we're going to alter how we interview you based off of how you best present.
Yeah, you're kind of laying out for me that really what our programs aim to do, as you said earlier, and I just want to kind of echo and highlight, is to make the process more human. Mm-hmm. Because compliance, which is, I feel like in this conversation turning into a bit of a 4-letter word, it's so inhuman. Mm-hmm. It's law, it's paperwork, it is standardization above all else. But you're right, people want to be seen as people, and I think that that's one of the biggest, overarching lessons to be gained from, systematizing a neuroinclusion program, is seeing people, as nuanced, as different than their peers, and that's a good thing, and it requires a bit of attention and work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that when we get to one of the big benefits of humanizing a process, you get to the maybe it's an overused buzzword, but you get to innovation, right? When you can think differently than someone else, which is a definition of neurodivergence, you're able to think differently on processes. You're able to think differently on how things are produced and sold, and the basics of the economy within your company can be altered when you take advantage of different ways of thinking and learning and socializing that come from neurodivergence. Mm-hmm. And so, to dehumanize that process, you kind of comply out the innovation by focusing just on that compliance element. And we get it, because when you look at things like violations around compliance on things like the ADA in the US, right? That's a bad thing. We don't want to be seen as violating any kind of compliance issue. But when you're editing your compliance to include people, it's a really helpful way of including people, right? And that's less of a risk. But we've sort of trained our systems and a lot of organizations to be very inflexible when it comes to standards and practices within the interview especially. And this is where we want to highlight that this is not a set system. This is not a law on how you need to interview people. Yeah, there are some laws that exist within that, and we should comply with them. We're not saying not to, right? But the flexibility to be more human is really a critical element to make your company's culture more neuroinclusive.
And flexibility, to your point earlier, can be systematized. It can be worked into your SOPs, your best practices, and with some time and care and consistency, it can be implemented, say, across your entire recruiting team, your entire talent organization, saying like, we are going to listen to our candidates and adapt to their communication styles. It doesn't have to be the only way to be compliant is to treat everyone exactly the same. I think that is an unfortunate fallacy.
Yeah. And I think it can also, I can see a lot of people listening who are picturing kind of production roles, right? And in this case study, I know what role you're referring to. It can be viewed sort of as a production. It's like, do the same things within these metrics, right? But there can still be really useful ways of including human elements and different ways of thinking and learning in those production roles. Because very often we see a frequent problem when employers are looking at, hey, we need people to meet these metrics over and over and over again. It becomes this kind of very rigid set of parameters in which they hire, in which they evaluate talent, and in which they kind of professionally develop that talent. And there's this misunderstanding that means that we need to follow the same process for hiring, for evaluation, to meet those metrics. And I think that that's another fallacy here. When you can allow people to be more individualistic, maybe production and evaluation, that maybe someone's production might peak and ebb and flow, but a more natural rhythm is going to be a much more human way of making that production happen.
Yeah. So back to this particular instance, I think one of the overarching kind of moral that I took away from this is, okay, where we started at the beginning of the partnership was, let's make this organization and our culture and our practices more neuro-inclusive. That statement and that goal implies something about what we're doing right now is not inclusive, because we're seeing disparities in our workforce in terms of the prevalence of or at least the disclosure of neurodivergent employees in our organization. We're beginning the partnership based on the premise of there are imbalances and there are barriers that are keeping this particular population from either making their way in or succeeding in our environment. So if that is the premise that we are launching this program on, then to achieve that goal, something has to change. And that was, I think, what was frustratingly for me not happening in this partnership was we kept kind of pushing a rock against an immovable object, I guess, some permutation of that analogy, saying there are barriers and we need to change the process to open the door to these people, but we don't want to change the process because that will disclose, that will put a spotlight, an unfair kind of imbalance on these people. Well, where I was coming from was there's already an imbalance, there's more to be gained, and these candidates, by taking part in our programs can, out loud on paper opt in to disclosing in order to access that support, saying, I acknowledge that I am disclosing to the interviewer, to the manager, because I want my process to be different, because I want support specific to who I am. But in this case, the feedback to us was, no, we can't change the process. We can't disclose on behalf of these people, and therefore we can't interview in a different way. We can't train or give any kind of heads up to the interviewer. Then the process looks pretty much the same, and the outcome also looked very much the same.
Right. And I think that when we zoom out again and look at the need for companies to change, we see a unfortunate, in the perfect world, I guess what I'm saying is we wouldn't need to change all of these processes because the existing process would be adaptable and flexible. But so much that rigidity of process is a really big red flag against neuroinclusion.
Definitely.
And I think that that's what we are kind of hoping that people will take away from this case study of, if you can make your process more flexible, more human, as you said, that's going to allow for so much ability to include the humans that are currently excluded. And I think that this, in a on the ground example, would be someone who struggles with social communication in an interview process, right? If we can alter how that interview takes place and give people some prompts ahead of time to be able to showcase their technical ability, their social ability, their processing ability on how to perform XYZ task, that's a fantastic way to help kind of create a flexible way to evaluate that person in a way that kind of meets them where they are. Whereas if we have a mechanized version that can't change, that has to operate within specific parameters, you lose that human touch, you lose that ability to see that person how they are, and you lose some really good talent.
Yeah. And just to restate again, that flexibility that you're talking about can be the standard procedure.
Right.
Our way, or a variation of our way of interviewing, like, you can apply that to everyone. So it's not singling out or special treatment for a group, and therefore breaking, your compliance expectations and your standardization. Like, it can be standardized that you are adaptive.
Exactly. And I think I got excited not to interrupt you, but I think that the idea here, most interviewers already do some adaptation of their interview under some specific parameters. And I would argue that these need to be expanded. And an example would be, you interview someone for an executive level position much differently than you interview someone for an entry level position.
Very true.
And that's a human adaptation that you're making. And it is kind of an unfair adaptation that you're making, because this person has a long track record of maybe experiences and expertise on a topic. Whereas the entry-level person, they have the ability and maybe the future to do all of those same things. But if you interview them based off of a compliance perspective, as opposed to an adaptive perspective on what their capabilities are, you're going to lose out on that talent.
Totally. There is one other point that I feel like was eye-opening to me from this case study is, okay, this is an indication to me of what happens when you want to have a neurodiversity program or a neuroinclusive culture, but you don't change the process. And I've stated that before, but some that brought to mind for me, because I kind of felt like, okay, my role in this is mostly just the sourcing part, just the first step and a half of the candidate pipeline. And, I've never worked for full disclosure, I've never worked for a staffing organization. That's something that we have, tried to make sure that NITW isn't, because we see the value in changing the process end to end. But it was a little bit eye-opening to me of like, is this what it is like when, you turn on a pipeline of diverse talent, say from a staffing organization that's just sourcing and funneling candidates, but not changing the process at all. And in which case, that painted kind of a dark picture for me of like, if neurodivergent job seekers out there are, opting in on staffing organizations, and maybe that staffing organization is saying, we specialize in staffing neurodivergent candidates, but there's no assurance of what's on the other side of the employer, whether the interview process or as an employee, then, based on this particular experience, it's not going to be a very successful outcome in the interview or in the role if all you're doing is, opening the door to neurodivergent candidates, but not changing anything about the environment that they're going into. In this particular experience that I had, it wasn't a successful, landing spot for these candidates that I was opening the door for.
Absolutely. And I think that looking in at the moral of the story, I think that we see that, say someone wants to know, is a program at a corporation or at a company a neuroinclusive program, or is it supportive of neurodivergent talent, right? A good question to ask would be, is the interview altered or adapted or supportive in any way of neurodivergent talent coming through that process?
Yeah.
And I think another element to ask is, are managers aware that people are neurodivergent coming through that process? And there's a trade-off here, again, with the disclosure piece. Sometimes in a perfect system, the managers don't need to be aware. But most of the challenge happens is that we're not in that perfect system yet. And so that disclosure can be beneficial if it is going to change the process for the neurodivergent person coming through.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean change unfavorably to everyone else. It just means allow people different ways to showcase and demonstrate their abilities, which is a perfectly natural thing to do.
Yeah.
If you were evaluating someone for a very non-traditional job, say a circus act, right? You're a trapeze artist, and you came and did a sit-down interview in a conference room.
Tell me about a time you were juggling responsibilities.
Right. That would make no sense, right? And so this is what we traditionally do in the interview process. We assume that all these capabilities can be evaluated on the other side of a conference or the other side of a video call. And allowing people opportunity to demonstrate can be really, really helpful.
Yeah. It feels like a reminder of something we've talked about in a previous episode of the interview is also an opportunity for the candidate to interview the company. Yeah. And I think that, any wise job seeker is going into the interview with that on their agenda as well, to see, what is the level of support? Is it surface level of just kind of opening the door but not providing any groundwork, or does it run deeper than that? So something to look out for all the job seekers out there, and something to keep in mind for all the workplace advocates there, that it has to be deeper than just opening the door or doing a training but not changing anything past that. To actually accomplish the goals that we and our audience, I think, share, there has to be more significant change.
Absolutely. And the one last point, I think, if you are on the HR side, if you're a hiring manager of any kind, one of the easiest adjustments that you can do in an interview process is send the agenda of the interview itself, or better yet, send the questions that you plan on asking, or even the category of questions within that agenda. Say, hey, first we're going to do an overview of the company. I'll present that as the hiring manager, and I will then ask if you have any questions, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about your background and experience, and maybe even this specific project. That's a really helpful way to, one, level out the playing field of that 50-50 relationship, but help that person prepare in advance, especially if they have some social anxiety, which everyone kind of does and should for a life-changing event such as an interview.
Definitely.
It can be really, really helpful as a starting place.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for talking through the case study with me. I hope it was informative to our audience. It was certainly, kind of eye-opening learning experience for me. It wasn't the outcome that we aim for, that we normally have. So, it was really revealing in that way. And I think, we'll probably have a positive impact on future programs for us.
Definitely. Well, thanks, Sean, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.